Hi, this is our first lesson entitled What is Culture? So, when you hear the term culture, what do you think of? Well, anthropologists have for over a century been trying to define this term. So, I'm going to give you a few ways to look at concepts of culture and how we can align it within the framework of this course. I'd like to just quickly start with this quote by Jeremy McClancy, an anthropologist, in which he defines anthropology and what the role of a cultural anthropologist is. So he states, anthropology is taking people seriously. It is about trying to understand how people interpret and act in the world. Anthropologists listen to what people say, watch what they do, and try to make sense of their worlds and their deeds by putting them into context. So as we move forward, and as you learn more about anthropology, specifically cultural anthropology, let's try to revisit some of what Jeremy is talking about. Looking at other people, taking them seriously, and understanding how other people make sense of their worlds. So this slide just shows an assemblage of various quotes and definitions of culture by many different anthropologists, some American, some Japanese, some British, all different ways of making sense of what culture means. I mean, we're looking at patterns, we're looking at more of a structuralist, functionalist approach by Tyler, who's a British anthropologist in the late 19th century. A complex whole versus programming of the mind, sets of attitudes, assumptions, and values. So there are very, very different ways that anthropologists have defined culture over the years. But I like to take a slightly more simplified approach to looking at what culture is. So this is another definition of culture, one that I've sort of pulled together from a number of different sources. Culture is a way of life. It's the context within which we exist, think, feel, and relate to others. It's the glue that binds a group of people together. Culture is a blueprint that guides the practices of people in a community, is incubated in family life, governs our behavior in groups, and helps us know what others expect of us and the consequences of not living up to those expectations. Another perhaps pithy way of defining culture, this is the way that I prefer to define it, is culture is what people do. Plain and simple. People do a lot of different things. We have different practices, we have different languages, different ways of doing things. And all people do things differently. Some of those things we do are behavior based, but most of the things we do are social in nature. And all of the things we do are based in some sort of cultural practice. This graphic will come back a little bit later when you have to do your first assignment. But cultural identity is made up of a lot of different factors. If you imagine yourself in the middle of this graphic, who are you and what is your culture? And we can see culture is very dynamic. It is made up of a lot of different social institutions, family, values, age, social class, place of birth, education. So take a moment and think about all of the different aspects and facets to your cultural identity. This next slide has some information about different cultural parameters. Now, I don't necessarily need you to know and understand all of these, but please know that all cultures have various aspects of these parameters. Concepts of individualism, power distance, uncertainty avoidance. That means the ways that people make sense of and understand situations that are uncomfortable or dangerous or unpredictable. Gender role differentiation. Gender roles that we have in our culture are not the same as gender roles in other cultures. But all cultures have the parameters that make sense of differences and expectations of one's gender. Action focus. Those are the differences in doing versus being. Who is the center of action? Space distance, and this is something that we don't always think about all of the time until we are confronted with another culture or a person from a different culture who uses space distance differently. So these are those ways that we either have distance to one another, our cultural standards for touching others, if someone is a close talker, if you're familiar with Seinfeld, any sorts of ways that people make eye contact or don't make eye contact, and also notions of privacy. And then finally, time orientation. We have a very structured time culture here in America. I mean, we wear watches, we have a saying, time is money. But not all cultures and people all over the world construct time in the same way. They have different awareness of time and different ways of marking time. These next three terms are really important in any introduction to anthropology or introduction to sociology course. The first term is norms. Norms are rules developed for behaviors and actions based on different values, and also norms can vary from place to place. Values are our cultural standards by which we determine what is good or bad, right or wrong. When I ask you what is something that you value, I'm not necessarily saying, oh, I value my car, or I value some sort of piece of personal property. You can also look at things that you value, such as freedom, family, and of course, education. The third term is taboo. Now, taboo are acts that are socially unacceptable. There are these really strong forms of norms that if these rules are broken, there's some serious consequences, and they really sort of shake the foundation of a culture. Now, we have a lot of taboos in our culture, and there are many taboos all over the world. These are usually topics I like to define taboos as things that make people very uncomfortable to talk about, things that really kind of give you a bad feeling. Here's another slide with just a list of things. I do want to tell you that there will be a lot more images and videos as we progress through the semester. But how is culture? How does it manifest? Well, it has different layers of depth. Some elements of culture are very deeply ingrained, and others are more surface. Some cultures are very deeply rooted in religious and spiritual understandings and rules and values, while others may be more economic in nature. Culture affects practices and interpretations of practices. Now, notice I'm saying practices and not behaviors. This is something conscious, and this is something I'm going to do very often. The term behavior is more associated with psychologists. I use the term practice. I think it sounds more social, and I think it better describes what people do. Culture is an individual and a social construct, so a lot of cultural behaviors and expectations are cultural. But if you go back to a few slides ago when I showed you that graphic, culture is also very individualized. You are still an autonomous singular person. So it's not fully an outside pressure that makes you who you are. Culture, number 4, culture is also learned. We learn how to be members of our culture. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in depth when we start exploring language. Number 5, culture is descriptive, not evaluative. Number 6, culture is dynamic and is subject to change. This is particularly important. Culture is not static. It is not something that is fixed. Cultures change, and as we become members of a more globalized economy and a globalized planet, we have to understand this and make sense of it. And one of the factors behind cultural dynamism is cultural diffusion. And this is the spreading of cultural items from one culture to another. So take a minute, go to your kitchen. If you have one, open up your spice drawer or your spice cabinet and look at all the different spices you have. Salt and pepper are two basics, but then there's a lot of other spices. And the fact that we have paprika and tarragon and marjoram and rosemary and thyme and all these incredible herbs and spices from all over the world, we can see this as the result of cultural diffusion. Are there such things as cultural universals? Yes and no. These are definitely up for debate, but these are all themes that we're going to be exploring as the semester progresses. So something we could say is all cultures have some form of language or communication. All cultures have some form of age and gender classifications. There are some standard ones that we see in many parts of the world, but there are other more remote cultures that don't necessarily use the same age and gender categories that we may use here in the Americas. All cultures have notions of marriage, kinship, and descent. All cultures have some form of child rearing and various family structures. And we're going to see a film on that, the film Babies, a little bit later this semester. Cultures have universals of privacy, also sexual behavior. All cultures have different rules for that. As we saw earlier, values and norms, body adornment, dress, tattoos, piercings, ways of defining gender, ways of expressing self, and various manipulations of the body. Cultures also produce and create their own art. All cultures have a sense of humor, definitely not the same amongst all cultures, but all cultures also play, and they also have various forms of games. Also, leadership roles, we can also see the term politics there, and belief systems or religion. So I know this is getting long, but here's just a few more slides looking at the practice of cultural anthropology. So what is it exactly that cultural anthropologists do? Well, there's a lot of things that we do, but we first have to be scientists. And when we study other cultures, we have to be very careful with our methods and the ways that we gather data from the people that allow us to observe them in their lives. So the four key ways that anthropologists make sense of their data are through descriptive ways of describing what people are doing, interpreting what it is that people do given a cultural context, anthropologists will explain to understand cross-cultural similarities and differences, and through this description, interpretation, and explanation, anthropologists share their findings to help others gain a greater understanding and increased respect towards others. Ethnocentrism is a really, really important concept in cultural anthropology, and it's something that we have to all really work together on preventing. And the only way we can prevent being ethnocentric is to really be unbiased and to really understand where our own ideas and thoughts and perceptions come from, understand who we are as cultural beings, and then in turn we can learn from other people and their cultures. So ethnocentrism is the tendency to view one's own culture as best and to judge the behavior and beliefs of culturally different people by your own standards. So ethnocentrism is so dangerous because it is the root of a lot of other big problems. Ethno means culture, centra means center. So it's the belief that your culture is best and everyone else who's different from you is somehow wrong or bad. To add to this discussion, group members that share a culture are often like-minded in thinking and believe that their culture, morals, values, customs are the right, true, or natural order, as opposed to other groups who can be deemed inferior. Now, we're going to be seeing a lot of different cultures from all over the world in this class, and sometimes you're going to see different practices that might make you uncomfortable. They might be confusing, or you might think they're sort of weird, and that's okay. But as anthropologists, we also have to take a step back and really make sense of the practices of other people. Just because someone might raise their baby differently than we raise our babies here doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's simply different. No way is better than the other. Now, here in America, especially in the quote West, we like to believe that everything we do is truly the best. But when we look cross-culturally, that may not necessarily always be the case. So it's really important to have an open mind as well as an open heart when we look at other cultures and we learn from other people. So this is a classic cartoon that shows American ethnocentrism. So this is a quote from Lisa Wade's blog, Defining Women's Oppression, the Burqa versus the Bikini. So we see on the left side of the panel, there is a woman, presumed American, looking over at a woman wearing a burqa, stating, "Everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture." And this is very often sort of the epitome of American Islamophobia. Looking at people who follow the Islamic faith, specifically women, and see them as victims of oppression. But let's flip the coin. Let's perhaps look at ethnocentrism from the other side. The woman wearing the burqa looking at the woman wearing the bikini, stating the opposite. Nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. So to go back to Lisa Wade's blog, many believe that women in the U.S. are the most liberated in the world. To quote Lisa, "Insofar as women in other societies live differently, they are assumed to be oppressed. Of course, women are oppressed elsewhere. But it is a mistake to assume that, quote, they are oppressed and, quote, we are liberated. This false binary makes invisible ways in which women elsewhere are not 100% subordinated, and women here also might suffer from gendered oppression." So there's that irony there, and it's always something to keep in the back of your mind as we explore other anthropological films and texts and images. It's a way of putting yourself in check, where your bias is coming from, and how can you have a more open mind towards others. Cultural relativism is the next term I'd like you to know. This term was coined by Franz Boas. He is the gentleman on the lower right-hand corner of the screen. He was a very famous anthropologist, Austria-born, really made his name at Columbia University in New York. He defines cultural relativism in that civilization is not something absolute, but is relative, and our ideas and conceptions are true only as far as our civilization goes. In other words, cultural relativism is the way to understand other cultures and beliefs and attitudes and ways of life in that person's own terms through the context of their own culture. It is the way to learn and to understand a group's way of life within that own context and also without prejudice. Now, the past 30 years, anthropologists have really discredited notions of cultural relativism. Let's think of some of the drawbacks. Thinking what all other cultures do are relative. What could be some of the problems? Well, some groups, and I fall into this camp, believe that there are potentially some universal human rights and values which should be used to evaluate other cultures. Do you agree or do you disagree? I think we can all agree that civil war, child soldiers, sex trafficking, these are all terrible things that happen in many different cultures all over the world. because these are human rights violations. So if we see a country undergoing civil war, or we see, let's say, for a contemporary example, see what's happening in Syria right now, as anthropologists practicing cultural relativism, do we step back and say, oh, well, that's just what's happening there now. That's their culture. That's just the way things are. Or do we step in and say, wait a minute, yes, this is rooted in history and beliefs and long-term political upheaval and uprising, but what is our role here? What is our role as anthropologists and as human rights activists? So this slide shows the various methods that anthropologists use when they are gathering data and researching a culture or a practice in some part of the world. They do direct first-hand observation of behavior practices, and we call that participant observation. You go to the field and you live with the people you're going to study. You learn from them. You feast with them. You spend a lot of time talking to them. You have conversations with varying degrees of formality. It can be interviews to just hanging out and chatting. The third is the genealogical method. This is not used quite as often. It's kind of what I call old school anthropology, but it's something that you are all going to practice a little bit later this semester. Anthropologists also do detailed work with key consultants, or we call them informants. We do a lot of in-depth interviewing as well, where we have some key informants and we do long life histories. We also have discovery of local beliefs and perceptions. Problem-oriented research, that is definitely the focus of anthropology today, especially looking at human rights and human rights violations. How can anthropology and their tool of ethnography be used to solve some of the world's biggest issues? Also, longitudinal research, made very famous by anthropologist Margaret Mead, was a long-term continuous study of an area, a village, or a site. And also team research is becoming much more popular now. Anthropologists pool resources and work together to conduct research at a site. So this slide shows you traditional ethnographic practices, what had been done in the past, not necessarily as much of what we anthropologists do today. We do more of a microethnography approach. There's also survey research used much more by sociologists, using a lot of heavy statistics, demographic data, and a lot of number crunching. And these data are also really important. The big data, the population data. This can help inform research on public health, education, etc. Anthropologists use this information on a minimal level to help inform research and to find research sites, but for the most part, we prefer more of a micro-analysis, looking at more of a small-scale study as opposed to a huge population study. And finally, here's the slide I'm sure you've all been waiting for. Here is anthropology theory. So much fun. Now, I'm not going to ask you to memorize this list by any stretch, but please know that if you do fall in love with anthropology, as I did as a freshman in college when I first took my Introduction to Cultural Anthropology course, you are going to need to know all of these men and women involved in making anthropology what it is today. So if you're interested in any of these topics, looking at cultural materialism or feminist anthropology, postmodernism, get to know some of these names because you're definitely going to see them again. So that concludes our first video audio lecture. I hope you enjoyed what I put together for you. If you have any questions about any of the materials I've shown you here, please do not hesitate to shoot me an email and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. Do know I'm not going to test you on any of these things in depth, but I do need you to have a basic understanding of culture, of anthropology, and what anthropologists do. Thanks again. Talk to you soon.